Topic 2.2, water in the IB core curriculum, and the essential idea here is that water is the medium of life. Notice that the water strider here is, seeming to sit on top of the water, and this happens to be because of several different properties of water, all related to hydrogen bonding, as you can see. Here are the understanding of the applications and skills. You will see these in your mastery checklist as well as your study guide, so I'm not going to read them to you. And so one of the things you have to understand is that water molecules are polar and that hydrogen bonds form between them. Notice that water has an oxygen atom and 2 hydrogen atoms, and that those atoms are covalently bound to each other. And this covalent bonding that occurs is an unequal sharing of electrons. And normally what a covalent bond is, it means that there's electrons being shared. And in here, that sharing is unequal because the oxygen has 2 lone pairs of electrons and the hydrogen only has 1 electron in its outer shell. And so this covalent bond that forms is very highly polar. And this unevenly distributed charge on the water molecule causes the formation of hydrogen bonds. And that hydrogen bonding confers many different properties to water that make it a unique liquid. First of all, it allows water to be cohesive. And if you'll see here, notice that the oxygen atom and of one water molecule is attracted to the hydrogen atom of another water molecule, and that is where the hydrogen bond forms. And so the ability of water to be cohesive, in other words, to stick together with each other, is because of that hydrogen bonding. Hydrogen bonding also allows for adhesion, surface tension, and capillary action, which is really important in plants so that they can get water. Okay. And so adhesion is the idea that water molecules stick to other molecules that have charged atoms as a part of their structure. This is usually going to occur through capillary action. As you can see, this is why water is able to get up to the tops of tall trees. And so this is what causes the process of transpiration to occur. Capillary action also happens when you happen to drink through a straw. So if you set a straw in a drink, you'll notice that a meniscus forms inside the straw. That is also due to capillary action. And you've also seen capillary action, with paper towels and water when you have a spill and you throw down a paper towel on top of it and the water seems to be sucked up by the paper towel. That's actually through capillary action. Okay, water has unique solvent properties that other solvents do not have, but one of the things that you've probably been taught is that water is called the universal solvent, which is actually incorrect because a universal solvent implies that it can dissolve everything, and that is not the case with water. Because water is a highly polar molecule, it makes it an unsuitable solvent for things that are nonpolar, but it does make it a fantastic solvent for other polar substances like sugar and also ionic substances like salt. And so you can see here in the diagram that you've got, water molecules that will dissociate ionic compounds like salt into their constituent ions, the positive sodiums being surrounded by the negative oxygens on the water, and then the negative chlorides being surrounded by the positive hydrogens as a part of the water molecule. Also, understand that substances can be hydrophilic or hydrophobic. Hydrophilic means water-loving, and this means that a substance can be attracted to water. And so anything that dissolves in water would be considered to be hydrophilic, such as things like glucose. Also, things that are ionic, like sodium and chloride ions. Also, things that water will adhere to would be considered to be hydrophilic, such as cellulose. Hydrophobic molecules are nonpolar molecules. They don't have a charge on them. They are still covalently bound, but they don't have an unevenly distributed charge. And so one of the most important hydrophobic compounds that we'll study later on are lipids. And those are things like fats and oils and, the things that make up your cell membranes. And so hydrophobic molecules are not going to dissolve in water. In fact, they're going to stay separate from water, and they will dissolve only in other nonpolar substances. One of the things that you have to understand as a part of the IB curriculum is how molecules are transported in the blood, because water does make up the bulk of your plasma, and as because water does make up so much of your plasma, it's important to understand how certain molecules are transported by the blood, because these molecules will be dissolved in that water. So for example, glucose, which is a super important solute that your blood plasma transports around your body, it is a polar molecule, so it's freely soluble in the water in the plasma, so it's very easily carried by the plasma. Okay? Amino acids are also soluble in water, and they do have what's called an R group, which we'll learn about when we talk about proteins. And that R group can be polar, it can be nonpolar, or it can be charged. And the R group does help determine the degree of solubility. So if, say for example, the R group is polar, then that amino acid is probably going to be very highly soluble in water. If it's a nonpolar R group, then it's probably not going to be as soluble. And these molecules are also carried by the blood plasma. Okay? Oxygen is a small nonpolar molecule, and it's important for you to understand that when water becomes saturated with oxygen at low concentrations, and that as temperature increases, the solubility of the oxygen in that water decreases. And so at body temperature, not very much oxygen gets carried by the plasma, and so there's not enough to be carried by the plasma itself, and so you have a protein called hemoglobin that actually does the job of carrying oxygen in your blood. Fats and cholesterol are huge, large nonpolar molecules that are not soluble in water, but they are carried by the blood in little, micelles called lipoprotein complexes. I want you to notice that in the diagram here you see a bunch of phospholipids that kind of surround, a core of the fats and the cholesterols on the inside. And so these molecules are going to be suspended in water in kind of sort of like a colloidal solution. And so they're not soluble in water. They are separable from the blood plasma itself. Okay? Ions such as sodium and chloride are going to freely dissociate in water, and they are also carried by the plasma. Okay? You also should understand that the water has high heat capacity, has a very high heat of vaporization, has a high heat of fusion. And these properties of water are due to the hydrogen bonds that must be formed or broken. It takes a lot of energy to form those hydrogen bonds, but it also releases energy when they're broken. And so when water is changed from one state to another, it takes a lot of energy to do that. And the really great thing about this is what allows the temperature of water to remain relatively stable. It doesn't undergo great shifts in temperature. So this is why our Earth is relatively temperate compared to other planets, because most of the Earth is covered in water. This is also why water makes a great coolant, not only for animals during sweating, but for plants as well, because they do transpire and water exits the leaves. Okay? Water does make a great coolant for us, okay, because it does take an awful lot of energy for water to change temperature. And so, when we sweat, water evaporates and it removes all that excess heat and it goes away with it. And so this feels good to our skin, and this allows us to cool off and to remain at a constant body temperature. Okay. And then we're also going to look at the properties of water and methane. Methane is a small nonpolar molecule. Notice that they're roughly the same as far as molecular weight goes. They're very small compounds, that they do have covalent bonds, but that one has nonpolar covalent bonds and that the other has polar covalent bonds. It's important that you understand that methane is not very dense in comparison to water. Water has a density of 1 gram per cubic centimeter, and that the specific heat capacity of methane is much lower than it is for water, and that the heat of vaporization for methane is much lower than it is for water. In other words, it takes a lot more energy to convert water from a liquid to a gas than it does to convert methane from a liquid to a gas. Notice that the boiling point of water is much, much higher than it is for methane, and that the melting point for methane is extraordinarily low. And the resources that were used to produce this presentation by Chris Paine, which was modified from a presentation by Chris Paine, are shown here.